Welcome to Venice, a city that floats, fragile, silent, and eternal. Tonight, I'll take you on a quiet journey through its history, its beauty, and its secrets. We'll drift together through centuries of art, empire, and reflection, moving slowly, as the city itself once did. Venice is not a city that shouts. It whispers. It reveals itself like light on water, softly, patiently, one ripple at a time. You don't arrive here by road, but by rhythm. The hum of an engine, the echo of footsteps on stone, the gentle slap of tide against marble. The air smells of salt and memory, the scent of centuries that refuse to fade. This is not a city you simply enter. It's a place that absorbs you, draws you in, and slows your heart until it beats in time with the lagoon. So let us begin, not with buildings or empires, but with what came before them all: the water, the silence, the beginning of Venice. Before there was Venice, there was only the sea, a vast expanse of water, shallow and shimmering, stretched between the Adriatic and the mainland. The lagoon, La Laguna Veneta, was neither land nor ocean, but something in between. At low tide, sandbanks surfaced like the backs of sleeping creatures. At high tide, the horizon dissolved into light. It was a place of change, of silence, of reflection. Long before any city existed, people already knew this landscape. Fishermen, salt workers, and hunters came with the seasons. They built temporary shelters on small islets that appeared and vanished with the moon. The lagoon was generous, but unpredictable. Storms could erase an island overnight and give birth to a new one by morning. To live here meant to surrender to the rhythm of water. Then came the 5th century, and with it, chaos. From the north and east, waves of invaders swept across the Italian peninsula: Huns, Goths, Lombards. Cities such as Aquileia, Padua, and Altinum were burned and emptied. The old Roman order collapsed, and people fled wherever they could. The mainland was no longer safe. Families escaped across the marshes with carts, animals, and what little faith they could carry. Some reached the island of Torcello. Others settled near Malamocco and Rialto. Here they built huts of reeds and wood, trusting that the sea would protect them where walls could not. No army could follow them through the tides. The water became their fortress. Life in those first years was harsh. There was no stone, no soil, no fresh water. Everything had to be brought from the mainland. The refugees fished, collected rain, and learned to read the winds. They lived with tides instead of clocks. But out of necessity, they began to invent. To anchor their homes, they drove long wooden piles deep into the mud, an invisible forest beneath the surface. The oak and alder hardened underwater, forming the foundations of what would one day become a city of marble. Over them planks were laid, and on those planks, houses, chapels, workshops. From the meeting of fear and ingenuity, a new form of architecture was born. Over time, the settlements grew. What began as scattered refugees became connected by channels and wooden walkways. Boats replaced carts. The lagoon itself became the road. Each island developed its own soul: Torcello, with its quiet churches; Murano, with its craftsmen; Burano, with its fishermen and painted walls. They adapted to water as others adapt to mountains or deserts, a dialogue between fragility and endurance. The lagoon offered not just food and shelter, but freedom. Far from kings and courts, these people built their own order. decisions were made by councils, guided by necessity rather than power. The habits formed here, caution, discipline, independence, would later define the Venetian spirit. By the 7th century, these small island communities were no longer refugees. They had become Venetians. When the Lombards ruled the mainland, the lagoon remained a free space, difficult to reach, impossible to control. Though they still honored the distant emperor in Constantinople, their hearts belonged to the water. A bell would ring across the mist, calling fishermen to prayer. Wooden hammers echoed from the boatyards. Even then, beauty was inseparable from labor, a harmony between the sacred and the practical. No one could have known that these humble islands would one day rule the seas. But the essence of Venice was already there, a people shaped by water, patience, and endurance. From the silence of survival, a new voice began to rise. By the 7th century, the lagoon was no longer a refuge. It was a home. Families had built lives, traditions, and trade routes upon the water. They fished, built boats, and exchanged salt and fish for grain from the mainland. A fragile economy had taken root between sea and sky. As the Lombard kingdom spread across northern Italy, the islands remained independent, protected not by walls, but by distance and tide. The people of the lagoon valued self-rule. They had learned that survival depended on unity, not hierarchy. Still, they needed leadership, and so, in the year 697, the communities of the lagoon elected their first doge, a title meaning leader, derived from the Latin dux. His name was Paolo Lucio Anafesto, and though legend surrounds him, his election marked a turning point. The Venetians now governed themselves. No longer refugees under foreign rule, they were citizens of a new kind of republic, a state born not from conquest, but from consensus. This early government was simple: councils of elders, local representatives, and a doge who ruled through dialogue rather than decree. Each island sent voices to the council. Together, they made decisions for the common good: trade routes, defenses, alliances. In time, this collaboration would evolve into one of the most stable governments in history, La Serenissima Repubblica di Venezia, the most serene Republic of Venice. Though still humble in power, the lagoon's people were already masters of negotiation. They traded with Byzantium, the great city of Constantinople, and began to build a network of trust across the Adriatic. Instead of armies, they sent envoys. Instead of fortresses, they built relationships. The water that once isolated them now connected them to the world. Boats carried not only goods, but ideas: mathematics from the east, faith from the west, art, language, and architecture. Every returning ship brought fragments of distant worlds. Venice absorbed them all, transforming difference into harmony. The city's motto could have been its nature itself: strength through balance, stability through change. Now, let's continue with the rise of Venice, from a small lagoon republic to a city of marble and power. The Doge, once a simple leader, became the symbol of the Republic's strength. He lived in a palace beside the great square of Piazza San Marco, the heart of Venice. Around him, councils formed: the Senate, the Great Council, and the Secretive Council of 10, each designed to share power and to prevent tyranny. The Venetians believed that stability came not from one ruler, but from many voices held in balance. It was a system both cautious and brilliant, a government built on trust, secrecy, and centuries of refinement. By the 10th century, this structure allowed Venice to grow beyond the lagoon. Its merchants sailed across the Adriatic and into the Mediterranean. They carried glass, salt, and cloth, and returned with silks, spices, and stories. Every voyage made the city richer, not only in gold, but in culture. At home, Venice glittered. Mosaics of gold reflected sunlight from the domes of Basilica di San Marco. The air smelled of wax and salt, of wood and incense. Bells marked the rhythm of the day, from dawn to dusk, from work to worship. Yet behind the beauty lay discipline. The Republic tolerated no chaos. Every decision, every trade, every alliance was recorded, weighed, and justified. Even the Doge himself could not act without approval. Venice had become a machine of order floating on water, a fragile miracle sustained by laws, commerce, and faith. Its people moved with quiet confidence, believing that their city was chosen, not by kings, but by destiny itself. Prosperity flowed through every canal. What began as survival had become sophistication, and Venice entered its golden age of trade. At the heart of this new wealth stood the markets of Rialto. Here, merchants shouted prices across the water, while gondoliers ferried bolts of silk and barrels of spices under bridges of white stone. Coins from every corner of the world clinked together in the sun. Venice had become the meeting point of continents, a living crossroad between east and west. Ships from Alessandria, Constantinople, and Tiro arrived daily. The scent of pepper, cinnamon, and sandalwood filled the air. Venetian glassmakers learned to imitate Eastern designs, while weavers turned silk into patterns of impossible detail. Among the merchants rose one family, whose name would travel farther than any ship, the Polos. In 1271, a young man named Marco Polo set sail from Venice with his father and uncle, crossing deserts and mountains to reach the court of the Great Khan in China. When he returned years later, his stories opened Europe's imagination to the wonders of Asia, and Venice became the city where East and West truly met. The power of the Republic was not measured in land, but in routes. Every trade agreement was a thread in its vast maritime web, and every Venetian ship carried the Republic's flag, a golden lion on a red field, symbol of Saint Mark, patron of the city. That lion flew over outposts across the sea, from Corfu to Crete, from Cyprus to Rhodes. Each island became a jewel in the crown of Venice's maritime empire. But even as the Republic grew rich, it remained cautious. Its greatest victories were won not with swords, but with signatures. Alliances, treaties, and secret negotiations kept the balance of power and made La Serenissima one of the most stable states in all of Europe. For centuries, this balance created something rare, a long, unbroken peace. And from that peace came beauty. Venice had the luxury to look inward, to build, to paint, to dream. Its wealth no longer flowed only through markets, but through the hands of artists and architects. The workshops around San Marco filled with color and light. Painters like Gentile Bellini, Titian, and later Tintoretto captured not just faces, but the soul of the Republic, its faith, its discipline, and its quiet pride. In the 16th century, music filled the air. Within the Basilica of San Marco, composers like Giovanni Gabrieli wrote harmonies that seemed to echo across the water itself. The sound was spacious, luminous, as if the city's architecture had found its own voice. And then came Antonio Vivaldi, the red-haired priest, whose violins captured the rhythm of Venice's seasons. His 4 seasons would one day become the heartbeat of the city itself, its tides, its moods, its endless return. Outside, marble palaces rose along the Grand Canal, their facades mirrored in the moving water, each reflection more beautiful than the last. Gothic arches blended with Byzantine mosaics and Eastern domes, a living testament to centuries of cultural exchange. Every window told a story. Every bridge connected memory with motion. And above it all, the bells of Campanile di San Marco rang through the mist, marking not only the hour, but the harmony between time and water. Venice had become the mirror of the Renaissance, a place where reason met beauty, and where art became a form of devotion. But even beauty cannot exist without shadows. As Venice shone brighter, new rivals emerged across the sea. The world that had once seemed infinite began to close in. The Republic's greatest adversary was another city born of the sea, Genoa. For centuries, the 2 maritime powers competed for control of trade routes, allies, and harbors. Their rivalry turned the Mediterranean into a chessboard of strategy and betrayal. Venetian fleets clashed with Genoese galleys near the islands of the Aegean and along the Dalmatian coast. Each victory was followed by loss, each treaty by tension. But Venice endured, guided not by passion, but by patience. While others fought with fire, the Venetians fought with finance. Gold and diplomacy replaced steel and blood. They learned to buy what could not be conquered, and to wait for storms to pass. In the 15th century, a greater challenge appeared: the rise of the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottomans advanced through the eastern Mediterranean, Venetian outposts and trade routes were threatened. For the first time, the Republic faced an empire larger than itself. Yet, even in war, Venice found opportunity. It traded with its enemies, negotiated with sultans, and maintained its influence through the very chaos that consumed others. When Constantinople fell in 1453, it marked the end of the Byzantine world, but not the end of Venice's presence in the East. From its harbors came fleets that supplied kingdoms, transported crusaders, and carried whispers of new discoveries. The Lion of St. Mark still flew proudly over the seas, but the world beneath it was changing. New powers were rising in the west: Portugal, Spain, and soon, beyond the Atlantic. The center of trade was beginning to drift away from the Adriatic and toward the unknown oceans. As the world changed around it, Venice turned inward once more. Its empire at sea began to fade, but its spirit of diplomacy endured. By the 16th century, the Republic no longer commanded the oceans as it once had. New trade routes around Africa and across the Atlantic had shifted the balance of power. The age of discovery was a triumph for the world, and a quiet loss for Venice. Yet even as its ships returned with fewer treasures, the city remained a beacon of refinement and grace. Where others sought conquest, Venice mastered endurance. Its merchants became bankers, its generals became diplomats, and its palaces became museums of beauty and restraint. No foreign monarch ruled here. No revolution tore down its walls. While kingdoms rose and fell, Venice endured, serene, distant, almost eternal. Visitors from across Europe came to see this miracle of marble and water. Writers described it as a dream made solid. Painters tried to capture its shifting light, and musicians heard in its echoes the sound of time itself. Even its decline was graceful. The city aged as an old actor does, aware that the play is ending, yet performing every scene with dignity. In the quiet canals, the reflections deepened. The stones held centuries of footsteps, and the water whispered the stories of those who had passed before. Venice had become more than a city. It was a memory that refused to fade. But every empire ends, even one built on water. By the late 18th century, La Serenissima was a shadow of its former self. The great merchant fleets were gone, the treasury drained, and the delicate balance that had kept the Republic afloat for 1,000 years began to falter. In 1797, the peace was finally broken. Napoleon Bonaparte marched into northern Italy, and Venice, tired, elegant, and unarmed, surrendered without a fight. The Republic that had outlasted kings and crusades ceased to exist. The Lion of St. Mark was lowered, the Doge's palace stood silent, and the city that had once ruled the seas became a possession, first of France, then of Austria. For the first time in a millennium, Venice no longer belonged to itself. Yet even in defeat, the city remained defiant. Its beauty could not be conquered. Where politics failed, poetry endured. Writers, artists, and dreamers began to see in Venice not a fallen empire, but a living work of art. The Romantic era rediscovered the city. Byron wrote of its haunted palaces. Turner painted its mists and fire and gold, and visitors from across Europe arrived seeking not power, but inspiration. They saw in Venice something eternal, a reminder that even as time erases greatness, beauty can remain. Gondolas once used for trade now carried lovers and poets. Music filled the decaying theaters, and the canals reflected a quieter kind of glory. Venice had lost its empire, but gained its soul. In the 13th century, before Europe's maps were complete, a boy was born in Venice whose name would circle the world. Marco Polo grew up among the salt air and sails of a republic built on trade. Venice looked outward to the horizon, believing that wealth came not from war, but from movement. Curiosity was its true treasure. His father, Niccolo, and Uncle Maffeo were among the first Venetians to travel beyond Christendom. They reached the Mongol court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. When they returned, 17-year-old Marco followed them east, unaware he would be gone for 24 years. Their journey began in 1271, across the Mediterranean and the deserts of Iran, over the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world. They faced cold and hunger, following the Silk Road, a network older than empires. Each stop brought new languages and faiths: Zoroastrians, Muslims, Buddhists. For the Venetians, who had known only the lagoon's canals, it was a revelation. The world was vast and connected. After 4 years, they reached China. In the court of Kublai Khan, Marco's quick mind earned the emperor's trust. He became an emissary, traveling through provinces larger than any European kingdom. He saw cities of marble and gold, bridges like rainbows, roads broad and straight. He described paper money, coal for fuel, porcelain and printing, wonders unknown in Europe. For nearly 20 years, Marco Polo lived in Asia. He observed the customs of Tibetans, Persians, and Mongols, learning that knowledge moved like water, and power flowed through trade, not armies. In 1295, the Polos returned to Venice. disguised and sunburned, they were unrecognized until they cut open their coats and poured out jewels and gold. They had come home changed, carrying a map drawn in memory. 3 years later, Marco was captured in war with Genoa. In prison, he met Rustichello da Pisa, and together they wrote Il Milione, the travels of Marco Polo. Part memoir, part vision, it told of silk, jade, spices, and cities beyond imagination. Many doubted him, yet his tales promised that the world was larger than belief. He spent his final years quietly in Venice, his thoughts still drifting east. When he died in 1324, he was buried in the church of San Lorenzo. His last words, "I have not told half of what I saw." His book traveled farther than he ever could, inspiring explorers and map makers, among them Cristobal Colon, known as Christopher Columbus. It redrew Europe's idea of the world. For Venice, Marco Polo became more than a man, an idea. He proved that the greatest journeys are not measured in miles, but in how deeply they change the traveler. Venice was not only a city of merchants and sailors, it was a city of color. Its streets shimmered with reflected light, its palaces glowed with marble and gold. And in the 16th century, that light found its master, Tiziano Vecellio, known to the world as Titian. He was born far from the sea, in the mountain town of Pieve di Cadore, surrounded by forests and snow. Even there, he saw the play of light, shifting over stone and water. And when he arrived in Venice as a boy, he recognized it again in the lagoon. The same restless brightness, the same reflection of heaven and earth. Titian studied under Giovanni Bellini, the elder of Venetian painting, and worked alongside Giorgione, the poet of soft light and silence. But where Giorgione's figures seemed to dream, Titian's began to live. He turned myth into flesh, devotion into warmth. In his hands, color became thought, a language more powerful than words. Unlike the painters of Florence, who sought precision and geometry, the Venetians sought atmosphere, the emotion of light. Titian laid color upon color, sometimes with his fingers, sometimes with brushes worn down to the wood. He painted not only what he saw, but what he felt the world becoming. His subjects ranged from saints to sinners, from popes to peasants. He painted Venus, radiant and mortal, Carlo V, Charles V, weary yet divine, doges who ruled the Republic, and the Christ who seemed to forgive them all. Each face was alive with movement, every shadow breathing like tidewater. Inside Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, his Assunta della Vergine, the Assumption of the Virgin, rises more than 7 meters high, a swirl of gold and red that lifts the viewer as much as the Virgin herself. The Madonna di Capezzaro, placed off-center, was revolutionary, a composition balanced like a ship in motion. These works defined not only Venetian art, but Venetian identity. Commissions came from emperors, princes, and the Senate of La Serenissima. Titian's portraits carried the authority of the sitter's soul, eyes that calculated, hands that hesitated, faces lit as if by memory. In altarpieces and mythologies, his color grew orchestral, deep crimsons, smoky blues, and glints of copper that seemed to move with the air. As the years passed, his brush grew freer, his colors darker and richer. In old age, he painted with his soul more than his sight. The paint thick, almost sculptural, light breaking through layers of time. He outlived rivals, teachers, even his own era. When the plague came in 1576, it took him 2. But the city honored him as a prince, carrying his coffin through silent streets. He rests beneath his own masterpiece, in the Frari, where choirs still echo, and candlelight trembles on stone. Titian's influence reached far beyond the lagoon. In Madrid, Velázquez studied his colors. In London, Turner learned how to make light itself the subject of painting. Centuries later, Monet looked at Venice and found the same vision Titian had once seen: the marriage of air, light, and water. Venice calls itself La Serenissima, the most serene, but in Titian's hands it was also passionate, human, alive. He painted the city's heart, its beauty and its decay, its faith and its desire. And still, when evening falls upon the canals and the water glows in copper and rose, it feels as if Titian is painting again, not on canvas, but on the living surface of the city itself. Venice has always been a city of sound, of footsteps, bells, and water against stone. But in the early 18th century, a new sound began to ripple through its canals, bright, passionate, and alive. It was the voice of a man with flaming red hair and a restless heart, Antonio Vivaldi, known to his students and to history as Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. He was born in 1678 in a modest home near the church of San Giovanni in Bragora. His father, a violinist at San Marco, introduced him to music when he was still a child. The boy's talent grew so quickly that by his teens he could outplay the city's best musicians. But illness shadowed him from the start, severe asthma that made long sermons impossible. So when he was ordained a priest, he rarely served the altar. Instead, he served through sound. Venice at that time was alive with contradiction, piety, and pleasure, wealth and decline. Music floated everywhere, from palaces and theaters to small bridges over the lagoon. And in the midst of it all stood the Ospedale della Pietà, a charitable orphanage for girls. Here, Vivaldi found his life's purpose. The young women were orphans and abandoned children, yet within those walls, they became a legendary orchestra. Hidden behind latticed screens, unseen by the public, they performed to packed churches. Travelers from across Europe wrote in astonishment about their precision and passion. And Vivaldi, their teacher and composer, gave them hundreds of concertos, each one a small world of emotion and light. He wrote faster than anyone could copy. More than 500 concertos, dozens of operas, sacred works, and sinfonias. His music seemed to mirror the movement of Venice itself, graceful, unpredictable, shimmering like reflected water. Each composition was a story. Spring arrived with birds and soft breezes. Summer burned with storms and heavy air. Autumn danced with wine and harvest. And winter whispered across frozen canals and candlelit windows. Together, these became Le Quattro Stagioni, the 4 seasons, a portrait of the lagoon's eternal rhythm. Vivaldi's violin spoke like a human voice, sighing, laughing, pleading, rejoicing. He transformed instruments into storytellers. Under his bow, wood and string became wind and tide. To hear him was to feel Venice breathe. He traveled beyond the lagoon, to Vienna, to Prague, to Mantua, composing for kings and courts. But though he found fame, fortune often escaped him. Tastes changed, styles moved on, and his brilliance was forgotten before his death. In 1741, he died alone in Vienna, buried without ceremony in a common grave. For nearly 2 centuries, his name slept in silence, until rediscovered by scholars and musicians who heard, in his notes, the very heartbeat of Venice. Now, his music returns each night to the city of his birth. Violins echo through churches and courtyards. Gondolas drift beneath stone bridges, and the air shimmers with sound. Vivaldi gave Venice something beyond faith or art. He gave it rhythm, a pulse that still moves through its canals, through its reflections, through its nights. And when the violins rise at dusk over the Grand Canal, it feels as if Antonio Vivaldi is still there, smiling, conducting the city's eternal song. Every city has its myths, and Venice, with its masks, its shadows, and its reflections, has more than most. Among them, none is more famous or misunderstood than Giacomo Casanova, the man who turned life itself into an adventure. He was born here in 1725, in a modest house near the church of San Samuele. His father was an actor, his mother a traveling performer. From his earliest days, the boy breathed the air of theater and illusion. Venice, with its carnival masks and labyrinthine alleys, shaped his imagination, a world where identity could shift like light on water. Casanova was no ordinary libertine. He was a scholar, musician, gambler, spy, philosopher, and storyteller. He studied at the University of Padua, spoke several languages, and moved easily between nobles and outcasts. He played the violin in the orchestra of Teatro San Samuele, preached sermons as a young cleric, and debated theology and mathematics with equal passion. Yet his legend was built not in libraries, but in salons and prisons. In 1755, accused of heresy and sedition, he was imprisoned in the Piombi, the Leads, a dark attic prison beneath the roof of the Doge's palace. No one had ever escaped it, but Casanova did. With cunning, charm, and a sharpened piece of iron, he broke through the ceiling, crossed the palace roof, and vanished into the night. Days later, he appeared in Paris, dressed, of course, in elegance and confidence. From there, his life became a tapestry of encounters and reinventions. He dined with princes, corresponded with Voltaire, and advised the Pope's secretary. He translated Homer, ran lotteries, and traveled from London to St. Petersburg. Wherever he went, Venice followed him, in his wit, his irony, and his unshakable sense of theater. For Casanova, seduction was not conquest, but conversation, a meeting of minds before bodies. He loved intelligence, curiosity, laughter. In a time when women had little freedom, he treated them as equals, sometimes even as teachers. It is what made him scandalous and unforgettable. But beneath the laughter and excess lay something darker, the loneliness of a man chasing the illusion of control. As the century turned, the Republic began to fade, and with it, the world Casanova had mastered. In exile, far from the lagoon, he worked as a librarian in Bohemia, surrounded by silence and memory. There he wrote his greatest work, Histoire de ma vie, the story of my life, a confession, a love letter, and a farewell to the city that made him. When you walk today through the narrow alleys near San Samuele, or cross the courtyard of the Doge's palace, his shadow still lingers, not as a sinner nor a saint, but as a mirror of Venice itself, brilliant, unpredictable, and alive with contradiction. He was both prisoner and escape artist, believer and skeptic, lover and observer, a man of his time, and somehow ahead of it. And when night falls, and the masks return for carnival, it feels as if Giacomo Casanova walks once more among the revelers, smiling, unseen, the spark within the shadow. As the laughter of that age faded, so too did the world that had given it life. Venice was about to face a silence deeper than any mask could hide. The glory of La Serenissima, the most serene republic, had ended with the march of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the story of Venice did not end. It entered a new age, one of war, empire, and survival. After 1797, the French tricolor flew above the lagoon. The great councils dissolved, and centuries of independence were signed away. When the French left, the Austrians arrived, turning the Doge's palace into an administrative office, the symbol of liberty into a seat of bureaucracy. Yet even under foreign flags, Venice refused to lose its soul. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe. And once again, Venice rose. Under the leadership of Daniele Manin, the citizens declared a new republic, free from Austrian rule. For nearly 2 years they held the city, starving and isolated, surrounded by the guns of the empire. When they finally surrendered, it was not defeat, it was endurance. Manin left the city, but his name remained carved into its memory. In 1866, Venice joined the new kingdom of Italy. The lagoon that once ruled the seas now found itself part of a modern nation. Factories appeared along the mainland. Trains crossed bridges that once seemed impossible. And yet, the city itself remained, fragile, unchanged, and eternal. The 20th century brought both beauty and destruction. During the First World War, the sound of engines replaced that of oars. Zeppelins hovered above the lagoon, and sirens echoed between the domes. In the Second World War, the Germans occupied the city, and the canals fell silent under curfew. But the bombs that shattered so many Italian cities never fell here. Venice survived again, not by strength, but by fortune and reverence. When peace returned, the world rediscovered her. Artists, writers, and dreamers came in search of something time had not erased. Hemingway wrote of her quiet cafes. Visconti filmed her faded beauty, and the Biennale of Art brought color and conversation back to her palaces. In 1932, the first Venice Film Festival lit up the Lido, and cinema, the new art of light, found its reflection in the lagoon. But modernity came with a price. Cruise ships, industry, and rising tides began to threaten the delicate balance that had held for 1,000 years. Each flood, Acqua Alta, climbed a little higher. Each year, the stones grew softer beneath the salt. And still, Venice endured, adapting, resisting, floating between ruin and renewal. In 2020, for the first time in generations, the canals ran clear. Boats were gone, the tourists vanished, and dolphins swam again beneath the bridges. It was a strange silence, beautiful, fragile, unforgettable. As if the city, after centuries of noise, had paused to hear itself breathe. Venice has survived plague, war, and empire. What it faces now is not invasion, but time itself. And yet, to stand on the steps of Santa Maria della Salute, watching the sunset over the Grand Canal, is to know that the city still lives, not as a relic, but as a heartbeat made of water, light, and memory. Venice has always been a meeting place for art and imagination, but in the modern world, it has become something more, a living exhibition, a dialogue between history and invention. While its political power faded long ago, its cultural influence only deepened. The city turned from empire to inspiration. The rebirth began with the Assisi, Venice Biennale. Founded in 1895, as one of the first international art exhibitions in the world. The idea was simple but radical, to gather artists from every country and show that beauty could transcend borders. After 2 world wars, the Biennale became a symbol of recovery, a place where nations once divided could speak again through color, sound, and form. Today, it hosts not only art, but architecture, dance, theater, cinema, and music, a calendar of creativity that never truly stops. The Venice Film Festival, born in 1932 on the sands of the Lido, was the first of its kind in the world. Here, the greatest directors and actors have walked the same red carpet that glows beneath the lagoon's reflected light. It was in Venice that early European cinema found its voice, and where filmmakers from Federico Fellini to Akira Kurosawa discovered that film could be poetry. Even now, each September the Lido transforms again, the scent of the sea mixing with cameras, crowds, and applause. Beyond the glamour, there is architecture. Every 2 years, the Biennale Architettura invites the world's designers to imagine how cities might respond to climate, technology, and human need. The questions asked in these pavilions echo far beyond the lagoon. How do we live together? How do we build with respect for the earth? For Venice, these are not academic concerns. They are questions of survival. The city itself remains the ultimate canvas. Artists, photographers, and writers return here endlessly, searching for the light that moves across the facades, the reflections that double every image, the silence that holds 1,000 footsteps. No city has been painted, filmed, or described more, and yet none seems less finished. Venice resists definition. It invites translation, then slips away again. Even as global audiences arrive with smartphones and streaming, Venice continues to give art its own pace. Museums like the Gallery dell'Accademia and the Peggy Guggenheim Collection stand side by side with contemporary installations in the Arsenal and Giardini. Old and new coexist like tide and stone, never still, always touching. To create here is to enter a conversation with time itself. Every brushstroke, every film frame, every chord performed in a flooded courtyard adds another layer to a story that began over 1,000 years ago. In Venice, art is not decoration. It is survival, a way to keep the city breathing, thinking, dreaming. From that soul came a second life, a life not of power, but of wonder. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Venice transformed again, not through conquest or commerce, but through art. Visitors no longer came to trade, but to feel. They came to drift through reflections, to listen to silence, and to find in the city's crumbling walls something of their own fragility. The city became a sanctuary for painters, writers, and composers. Wagner composed here, Hemingway drank here, and in every narrow alley, someone sketched the play of light upon the water. In 1895, Venice created its greatest modern tradition, the Biennale, a festival that celebrated creativity instead of conquest. It became a gathering of the world's artists, a meeting place of ideas, colors, and forms. Soon after came the Venice Film Festival, the first of its kind, where the art of moving images met the art of a city that seemed to float. For a few weeks each year, the lagoon became a stage of light and shadow, as stars arrived by boat beneath the same bridges that once carried merchants and monks. Tourism followed, as it always does with beauty. The city that once feared invasion now welcomed the world. Gondolas replaced galleys, cameras replaced compasses. And yet, the rhythm of the water remained the same. Venice became a paradox, a living museum, sustained by those who came to admire its decay. Its survival depended not on empire or economy, but on the shared desire to keep its dream alive. For even as its walls crumble and its tides rise, Venice endures, not because it resists time, but because it accepts it. In November of 1966, Venice awoke to a silence that sounded like fear. Through the night, winds from the Adriatic pushed the tide higher and higher, until the sea itself entered the city. By dawn, water covered nearly every square. The level reached almost 2 meters above the normal tide, the highest flood in the city's recorded history. Boats floated where people once walked. Electricity failed, libraries flooded, and centuries of archives dissolved into salt. At Piazza San Marco, waves surged against the mosaics of the basilica. Artisans waded through knee-deep water, trying to lift icons and paintings above the rising tide. In the small workshops of Murano and Burano, families stood in silence, watching the water reach their doorsteps. When the sea finally retreated, Venice was left covered in mud and silence. Thousands of homes were damaged. Churches and palaces were scarred by salt and decay. But what the water had revealed was something deeper, a truth everyone already knew, but few dared to face. Venice was sinking. The flood of 1966 became a turning point. It was no longer possible to believe that the city could survive on luck and devotion alone. Scientists, engineers, and governments began to ask the same question. How do you protect a city that floats? In the years that followed, new systems were studied, tide gauges were installed, and global research into climate and ocean patterns began to focus on the lagoon. The term acqua alta, the high water, entered the world's vocabulary. It became not just an event, but a symbol of the fragile balance between civilization and nature. Finally, in 2003, construction began on a monumental project, a series of underwater barriers designed to rise from the seafloor and block the tides. They called it MOSE, from the name of Moses, who once parted the waters. Each barrier was a vast metal gate, anchored deep beneath the lagoon. In moments of extreme tide, compressed air lifts the gates upward, sealing off the inlets that connect Venice to the Adriatic. It is a system of faith and physics, a modern miracle built to save an ancient one. The project took nearly 2 decades to complete. By the time most became fully operational in 2020, the world had changed once again, and the seas had risen higher still. For now, it holds. The city remains dry through storms that would once have drowned it. But every Venetian knows that nothing here is permanent. The lagoon gives, and the lagoon takes away. Venice today is a paradox, a city that lives and decays at the same time. It stands between 2 tides, the slow rhythm of daily life and the endless movement of visitors. Every year, millions arrive to walk its narrow streets, cross its bridges, and take photographs of a city that seems to float between centuries. But beneath that beauty lies another truth. The people who make Venice breathe are becoming fewer each year. A century ago, nearly 200,000 people lived within the lagoon. Today, fewer than 50,000 remain. The rest have moved to the mainland, to towns like Mestre or Marghera, where rents are lower and everyday life is easier. Here in the old city, groceries are carried by boat, furniture by crane, and children reach school by water bus. Every repair, every delivery, every errand takes patience and planning. Living in Venice is not a dream. It is work. For those who stay, the rewards are unique. The sense of belonging, the sound of church bells reflecting across the water, the feeling of a city small enough to know by heart. But many Venetians now live surrounded by a constant flow of visitors. Before the pandemic of 2020, Venice received more than 25 million tourists each year. On peak days, the number of guests outnumbered residents 10 to 1. The narrow streets became rivers of people, moving endlessly toward Piazza San Marco. Shops once serving locals turned into souvenir stalls, and the price of ordinary life rose with every passing season. For some, tourism means survival. Guides, gondoliers, hotel workers, glassmakers, and artisans all depend on it. Without visitors, the city's economy would collapse. But dependence has a cost. Traditional homes are converted into short-term rentals, and young Venetians are priced out of the neighborhoods they were born in. Schools close from lack of children. Bakeries and small groceries give way to cafes and fashion boutiques. Bit by bit, the fabric of the community wears thinner. Local councils and citizen groups have tried to slow this tide. There are proposals to limit daily tourist numbers or introduce an entry fee for day visitors. Some projects focus on supporting artisans and permanent residents, offering subsidies for long-term rentals or preserving historic workshops. Others are turning to technology, promoting quieter, cleaner electric boats to reduce pollution and wake damage. Every idea reflects the same question. How do you keep a city alive when it is also the world's stage? And yet, through all of this, Venice continues to live. Every morning, market boats bring vegetables and fish from the nearby islands. At sunrise, bakers light their ovens, and the scent of fresh bread drifts across the canals. Children hurry to school boats, gondoliers polish their oars, and shopkeepers sweep the stone outside their doors. For a few hours each day, before the crowds return, the city feels like itself again, quiet, human, ordinary. Venice has survived empires, plagues, and wars. Now it faces a different test, the slow erosion of community. But those who remain here do so not because it is easy, but because it matters. They believe that living in Venice is a kind of stewardship, a promise to the past, and a quiet act of defiance against time. For them, every day is a small victory over water, over gravity, over the odds, and that is what keeps the city alive. Venice has always been more than its stones. For all the beauty of its palaces and canals, it is the people who give the city its true form. Every bridge, every shadowed alley, every worn marble step has been shaped by their hands. To understand Venice, you must listen not to the water, but to the voices that echo above it. The Venetians are a rare people, resilient, practical, and endlessly patient. Their lives follow the rhythm of tides and seasons, a pattern that outsiders rarely notice. In the mornings, small boats glide through narrow canals, delivering bread, fruit, and milk from the mainland. You hear the clatter of shutters, the hum of engines, and the faint song of a gondolier, tuning his voice before the day begins. The gondola itself is a piece of living history. Each one is built by hand in the old shipyards called squarey. The craft has changed little since the 16th century. 28 different kinds of wood, each chosen for its strength or flexibility. No two gondolas are exactly alike. For the boat builders, this is not just work. It is a dialogue with water, a craft passed from father to son for generations. On the island of Murano, the furnaces still burn as they have for 700 years. Inside them, sand becomes glass, fragile, transparent, and eternal. The art of vetro di Murano was once a closely guarded secret. Glassmakers were forbidden to leave the island under penalty of death. Today, that tradition survives through the hands of a few masters, their movements rehearsed and precise. The glow of molten glass reflects in their eyes, like a small sun rising inside the workshop. Nearby, on Burano, lace makers sit in quiet rooms, their needles flashing through fine thread. The patterns they create are as complex as any cathedral ceiling, woven with patience and pride. Each stitch is a memory of mothers and daughters who learned the same craft centuries ago. There are fishermen, too, who still set out before dawn into the lagoon, and market sellers who call out prices on the steps of the Rialto. There are teachers, nurses, artists, and old men who sit in cafes arguing about football and politics. For them, Venice is not a dream. It is home. They live with its inconveniences and its miracles, and they remain because leaving would mean forgetting who they are. These are the true guardians of the city. They are not the ones whose names appear in guidebooks, but those who keep the streets clean, repair the boats, tend to the churches, and tell the stories of how things used to be. Without them, Venice would still exist, but it would no longer be alive. Venice has always been more than a city. It is an idea, a reflection of what humanity can build when it chooses grace over power. Every stone, every bridge, every ripple on the lagoon carries a fragment of time. Here, the centuries do not pass. They accumulate, layer upon layer, like the silt beneath the water. For most of the world, time moves in a straight line. In Venice, it moves in circles. Morning light returns across the same facades that have seen 10 generations rise and fall. The bells of San Marco still mark the hours, just as they did when the Doges ruled, and merchants set sail for the east. To live here is to exist inside a memory that never quite fades. Writers have tried to describe it for centuries. Some called it a dream, others a ruin. Henry James once said that Venice was the most beautiful sepulchre in the world. But the truth is gentler than that. Venice is alive precisely because it is fragile. Its beauty depends on impermanence, the shimmer of water, the slow decay of stone, the way light seems to forgive everything it touches. For Venetians, this awareness of time is not romantic. It is daily life. They see how the lagoon rises higher each year, how the salt creeps into foundations, how tides steal a few more millimeters from the steps of old palaces. But they also know that endurance is not measured by permanence. It is measured by renewal, the quiet persistence of continuing to exist, of repairing what has been damaged, of believing the city is still worth saving. Around the world, Venice has become a mirror for our age, a warning, and a promise. It reminds us that civilization is delicate, that beauty and survival depend on balance. If Venice can endure, perhaps we can too. But it also asks a question that no other place can ask so clearly. What do we owe to time? Do we accept its passing, or do we build in defiance of it? At night, when the crowds are gone and the streets echo with the sound of water, the city seems to breathe again. You can hear footsteps on stone, the distant hum of a vaporetto, the soft slosh of tide beneath the bridges. The moon rises over the lagoon, and for a moment everything feels suspended, neither past nor present, but something in between. Venice is not eternal. It was never meant to be. Its beauty lies in the way it accepts its own mortality, and yet continues to live as if time itself were just another tide to outlast. The city does not resist the water. It learns to move with it, to float rather than fight, to find balance in motion. Perhaps that is the lesson Venice offers to the world, that the measure of civilization is not how tall we build, but how gracefully we endure. The city floats, the water rises, and still, the bells ring. And so, our journey through the floating city comes to rest. Venice drifts once more into silence, a silence filled not with endings, but with echoes. The water carries away our footsteps. The light fades from the marble, and time resumes its gentle flow. What remains is the feeling of the place, the sound of a bell across the lagoon, the scent of salt and stone, the shimmer of reflections that never repeat. Venice is not something to be understood, only remembered. As the tide returns, so will the city, and those who love it. For every generation finds its own Venice, and in doing so, keeps the dream afloat. Thank you for joining this quiet passage through water and time. May the calm of the lagoon stay with you tonight, long after the last bell fades into the mist. And next time, we'll journey together to another of the world's most magical city, a new story, a new reflection, waiting just beyond the horizon.